Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into the fascinating and honestly often paradoxical relationship between two massive systems that completely shape our modern world: capitalism and modern democracy. You can think of these as the twin engines driving our global society, but as we're going to see, their relationship is deeply, deeply complex. It's a huge question, right? You hear it in the news constantly. Are free markets and free elections a perfect match, or are they fundamentally incompatible? So let's use our sources today to objectively unpack this mystery. Do these two powerful forces actually work together in harmony, or are they destined for a collision? Section 1. Defining the capitalist system, the pillars of the market. Before we get into the friction between these two systems, we really need to clearly define what we mean when we talk about the capitalist system itself. According to the International Monetary Fund, capitalism relies on a few core pillars functioning together. It's a system where capital assets, think factories or railroads, are privately owned. Prices are determined dynamically by the market to allocate resources. And think about your own life for a second. You have the absolute freedom to choose. You get to pick which smartphone to buy, and you have the freedom to quit your job for a better one. Finally, the government plays a limited role, mostly just stepping in to protect those rights of private citizens. But the exact recipe of how these pillars mix has changed drastically over time. To see how that evolution happened, we can look to Harvard economist Danny Roderick. He distinguishes between three historical variants of capitalism. We start with capitalism 1.0 back in the 19th century, which was largely unregulated with a very minimal role for the state. Then, post-World War II, we shift to capitalism 2.0. This era embraced Keynesian economics, meaning a substantial role for the state in regulating markets, plus strong welfare states. Finally, from the 1980s onward, we enter capitalism 2.1, which is characterized by a return to unregulated markets and massive globalization. It's wild to see how the rules of the game basically completely rewrote themselves over just a single century. Section 2. The case for compatibility. Economic freedom as a prerequisite. So let's dive into the thesis that capitalism and democracy are essentially best friends. This is a view supported by historical coincidences, like the expansion of voting rights, happening right alongside industrial capitalism in 19th century Britain. Political scientist Robert Dahl argues that capitalism drives economic growth, which in turn builds a large middle class. And a strong middle class is incredibly beneficial for a stable democracy. But maybe most importantly, a market economy prevents the government from centrally controlling everything you do. By decentralizing economic control, you heavily reduce the risks of tyranny and authoritarianism. Economists like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek actually take this a step further. Friedman argued that the economic freedom provided by capitalism is an absolute prerequisite for political freedom to even exist. Think about the words voluntary and repressive here. Friedman's point was that because you voluntarily choose to buy or sell, a diverse web of activity forms that authoritarian leaders simply cannot control. And that diversity, it's a fundamental threat to repressive leaders because it strips away their power to coerce the population. But flip the coin, and you hit a starkly different view. Economist Clara Mattei argues that capitalism and democracy are actually fundamentally incompatible. Her argument revolves around one crucial concept: agency. Real democracy requires citizens to have economic agency. But because capitalism inherently requires the vast majority of people to depend on selling their labor to an employer just for their basic survival, she argues it inherently undermines the exact freedom and agency that democracy promises. Section 3. The inequality and conflict problem, the inevitability of wealth concentration. This tension brings us to a major critical perspective on how capitalism directly impacts the democratic process, specifically through inequality. Economist Thomas Piketty analyzed a massive collection of data going all the way back to the 18th century to prove a pretty startling mathematical reality. In contemporary market economies, the rate of return on investment frequently outstrips overall economic growth. Because of compounding, if capital grows faster than the overall economy, wealth continuously pools at the very top. Critics argue this immense concentration of wealth completely undermines the ideals of social justice that our democracies are built on. Sociologist Jürgen Habermas took a structural look at this and observed 4 specific features in what he calls advanced capitalism. It's basically a systemic cycle. We see a concentration of activity in just a few massive firms and a constant reliance on the state to stabilize the economy whenever it falters. But most critically for our topic, Habermas suggests that formal democratic government is often just used as a tool to legitimize these state activities. Meanwhile, nominal wage increases, which are basically small pay bumps that don't actually increase your purchasing power, are handed out simply to pacify restless segments of the workforce and quiet down opposition to the system. So, if the relationship between these two systems is this strained, and inequality creates this much friction, it begs a fascinating question that complicates the whole narrative. Do free markets actually need free elections to succeed? Section 4. The authoritarian capitalist reality. Economic growth under strict rule. The historical reality is that capitalism has survived and sometimes exponentially thrived under political regimes that are anything but democratic. Let's ground this theory in some stark historical examples. Look at Singapore. It operates largely under one-party rule with a regulated press, yet it has a highly successful, intensely competitive open market. The private sector in China has grown exponentially under an authoritarian government. Augusto Pinochet's military rule in Chile used authoritarian means to create a safe environment for investment, which led to growth, albeit paired with really high inequality. And in Indonesia, Suharto's authoritarian reign aggressively expanded capitalism. These examples prove pretty definitively that you can absolutely decouple the capitalist profit motive from democratic political freedom. Section 5. The Modern Balancing Act. Saving capitalism from the capitalists. Knowing that capitalism can function perfectly well without democracy, democratic societies have to perform a really delicate balancing act, because pure free markets can lead to massive monopolies and pure state control can lead to tyranny. The IMF notes that this tightrope walk looks totally different depending on where you live. For instance, we have liberal market economics like the US and the UK. These are highly decentralized, very competitive, and akin to pure free market capitalism. Contrast that with coordinated market economies, like those in Germany and Japan. Here, the market is still capitalist, but private information is exchanged and coordinated through non-market institutions, like major labor unions and business associations. But when that delicate balance collapses, things get dangerous fast, and we see some highly destructive variations emerge. State-guided capitalism is where the government tries to decide which specific sectors will grow. The pitfalls here are massive, excessive investment, picking the wrong market winners, and rampant corruption. Then there's oligarchic capitalism. This system isn't even oriented toward overall economic growth at all. It exists purely to protect and enrich a very narrow fraction of the population, which obviously leads to massive inequality. So, what's the fix? According to economists Raghuram Rajan and Luigi Zingalis, society must actively save capitalism from the capitalists. If we want to protect the public interest from powerful private entities, they argue we have to follow 3 key steps. First, limit the concentration of ownership to ensure true, fierce competition. Second, the public has to oppose crony capitalism and government interventions that only exist to protect powerful incumbents. And third, because competition inherently creates winners and losers, a democratic society must ensure that the losers are properly compensated so they aren't completely left behind. Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder today. We've seen that capitalism doesn't inherently guarantee democracy, and unchecked, it can actually threaten it. So, as the gap between the ultra-rich and the rest of us widens, and as authoritarian markets continue to prove they can thrive economically, will democratic societies choose to step up and actively steer the capitalist system? Or will they sit back and let the market steer them? Ultimately, the future of our modern democracy might just depend on exactly who is holding that steering wheel.